He was a caregiver. He was working hard to send money back to Cuba for his mother and grandmother.
He was living his best life. You know, he had a relationship, a great job, great friends.
The dispatcher hears someone screaming.
After that, 2 gunshots, and the line goes dead.
He says, hey, it's over between us. I found a new person. He blindsides him.
This is like a complete shock to his system. He's now enraged.
You've got unrequited lover who is angry because he's been fooled.
No, I need you to tell me, is this something that got out of control?
To plan the breaking and entering, to bind him, the knife, the hammer, this is overkill. Like, this is insane.
St. Petersburg, Florida. Around 10 a.m. on December 21st, 2011, Pinellas County 911 receives a harrowing phone call.
The dispatcher, on the other hand, basically hears someone screaming.
You could hear the sheer terror in the victim's voice. And the 911 operator was trying to get a location for where he was, but he was so terrified that he couldn't spit it out.
What is the address?
The dispatcher tried to identify who the person was on the other end of the call. What they can get from him is that his name was Landy.
Then the call takes another disturbing turn.
Here's what appears to sound like 2 gunshots. And at that point, the screaming stops.
The line goes dead. No one answered the phone on callback.
The dispatcher jumps into action.
They're able to use the cell towers to try to triangulate the area where the call was being made from. Because it's coming from a cell phone, it's not exact. It can give you an area within a couple of blocks, sometimes, or within a couple of 100 feet.
2 deputies, 2 separate units were dispatched to the location.
It's about quick thinking, getting people on the ground to try and find out what's going on and possibly locate or stop whatever is happening to Landy.
Landy Martinez Esquivel was born in Cuba on December 13, 1990.
Landy Martinez moved here with his father to South Florida when he was about 4 years old.
His mom, his grandmother, and I guess other siblings were still in Cuba.
He came out when he was 18 to his family and friends. His father supported him. He decided to make a break and move to the St. Petersburg area. For the LGBTQ community, there was a real shift in around 2010 and both a couple years before and afterwards, where St. Pete really became the epicenter for that community to live, thrive, open their own businesses, small businesses, restaurants, bars, that sort of thing.
Handsome and friendly, Landy found an instant community in St. Pete.
He was just this very fun-loving, outgoing person who loved people, loved his friends, just liked to have a good time.
He wanted to be, an openly gay man in a friendly community. He really genuinely loved people and loved being around people.
To support himself, Landy worked as a certified nursing assistant.
He started working in a skilled nursing facility where he took a real liking to the elderly people that had Alzheimer's.
He was working hard to send money back to Cuba for his mother and grandmother. He was a caregiver, he would help the residents take showers, get dressed, eat, helped with activities. If they were lonely, he'd sit by them and things like that. He actually really cared about all the residents. and they loved him to death.
At age 19, Landy began dating Jose Adame.
He did introduce me to him, told me they met over the internet, invited me over to the house. First impression, he seemed nice, sweet, genuine. They were a typical couple, cute, little kissies here and there, hugs, hold hands.
Once he found, his first real boyfriend online, he really devoted himself to that person, and that's, I think, he strived for in his early life, as that's what he wanted. He wanted to find love.
Eventually, the couple moved in together.
Landy's working at a nursing home, helping people at the end of their life. Jose's kind of a stay-at-home person.
Jose, he wasn't legal, so he couldn't really get a job right away. Odds and ends, he was a Avon lady. You can go door to door, but he would give Landy or me books. We'd take him to work.
From Landy's perspective, he was living his best life. He had, a relationship with someone who he obviously cared a great deal for. He had a great job, great friends.
But on the morning of December 21st, 2011, 21-year-old Landy makes a desperate call to 911.
You hear him pleading for his life. After that, you hear 2 gunshots, and the line goes dead.
When he's calling into 911, they can kind of use the cell towers to try to narrow down the area in which they are, but they can't get an exact address. Once they get to the area, then the deputies have to start knocking on doors and find out if anybody heard or saw anything.
Then about an hour after the initial call, another 911 call is received from North Carolina.
The caller identifies herself as Yadira Guzman.
She calls in and says, my girlfriend and I are snow skiing in North Carolina. We have security cameras on our house. They're no longer working. They could see it from their smartphone.
So she immediately called 911 because why were the cameras not on? It was very odd that there was no feed coming from them.
Something else adds to her concern.
She had been trying to reach her roommate, Landy Martinez. He wasn't answering phone calls, wasn't responding to text messages.
Here's the address. I have a real concern. Can you please do a welfare check?
The deputies were dispatched out to the address.
They knock on the front door, but get no response.
As the deputies walked around the back of the house, they realized that there was a broken window to the back of the house and that the screen to that window was sitting on the ground beneath the window. There was also a door to the back of the house that was slightly ajar. And at that point, deputies realized that there could be something going on inside the house, requested backup, and eventually entered the house.
These are tricky situations when you have, an open door or broken window. Is the suspect still inside?
The deputies began to walk down the hallway, just clearing rooms as they go down. They reach the bathroom about 2/3 of the way down the hallway. Notice that there's some blood on the floor in there. The water's running inside the sink. And as they continued to clear the house, they made it to a bedroom that was on the northeast corner of the house. And that's when they found the victim deceased in the home.
That they found a Hispanic male victim face down on the floor, blood. He was wearing a t-shirt and underwear, and they noticed that he was soaking wet.
A look at his driver's license photo confirms the victim is the original 911 caller, Landy Martinez.
He's clearly deceased, so they back out and they secure the residence.
When they go out to do a welfare check, the best for them is when they find the person and he or she is okay. In this instance, it came with the other one. There's a crime scene here, there's a homicide now, and we've got to go from trying to find if this person's okay to find out who did it.
About an hour after he placed a desperate 911 call, Pinellas County Sheriff's deputies discover the body of 21-year-old Landy Martinez inside a St. Petersburg home. Detectives arrive on the scene.
He is soaking wet. He's still wearing his underwear and a t-shirt. But if there were knife wounds on Landy's hands and parts of his body.
The victim had what appeared to have been tape residue on his arms and on his legs.
He had a lot of wounds on him. He had a lot of bruising on the hands. He had the laceration on the forehead.
The wounds are mostly superficial until investigators identify the cause of death.
He had been shot on the left side of his head, right behind the left ear. He had also been shot once in the chest.
There were shell casings that were recovered near his body, which means he was shot at fairly close range.
Investigators searched the house for more evidence.
The whole place was just like ransacked, as if there had been a fight or something.
It looks like it was potentially a burglary. You had electronics that were stacked up, near the door, duffel bags that were full of electronics. The TV was taken off the wall.
But a closer look points to something more sinister.
In the bathroom, it's kind of old style where it's a tub with a shower and it has the sliding glass doors. Those doors are off the track and angled. There's blood, visible blood, on the inside of the tub, on the outside of the tub.
The victim had to be in the bathroom at some point in time, and that there was some sort of a struggle that went on.
There was a knife on the counter of the sink. There was a hammer, a claw hammer on the sink counter. And there was a cotton glove, like gardening glove, inverted, kind of balled up like it was taken off. It was only one glove, not two. In the bathroom, we find duct tape. Pieces of duct tape. Upon further examination, you'll see hair stuck to the duct tape. And then when you examine the body, you'll see where his wrists are missing hair. And you'll also be able to see the width, which is consistent with the duct tape. And it's kind of a lighter color. And then the same thing we see on his ankles.
He was clearly bound with duct tape, probably placed in the shower at some point, was being, tortured.
An exhaustive search of the house turns up a potentially important piece of evidence.
Landy's cell phone was actually found in the bedroom just south of where he was. According to the investigator that located the cell phone, it was under the mattress in the bedroom in the southeast corner of the house.
Investigators locate the security cameras.
The cameras were all exterior cameras. Although you could look at the cameras, real time, nothing was being recorded.
The live feeds had been disconnected when whomever it was that was inside the house disconnected the computer.
You've got a very serious crime scene, what appears to be a murder. And so now you got to shift into the mode of who did this and where are they?
Based on a clue from Landy's 911 call, detectives believe they might be looking for more than one suspect.
He said that they are trying to kill me. We believe at least, at a minimum, that there were at least two people involved. There could have been more, but we know that there's at least two people that were involved. Evidence-wise, there's nothing at the scene that points to a specific person.
So they started combing the neighborhood to see if there were any suspicious folks around, or if any of the neighbors saw anything, or there was any video from a home camera, a security camera.
The neighborhood canvassing detectives were able to come up with, there were 2 people at the time of this offense going door to door selling magazine subscriptions. Generic description, younger males, college age.
There were 2 guys on the day of the murder that were selling magazines door to door. And some of the neighbors said they were extremely aggressive and felt like, at least one said they wanted to come in the house and she didn't want to let them in the house. They thought, they sound like good suspects.
There was a potential, could one of them have done this? Where are they? How far have they gotten?
Pinellas County homicide detectives are at a St. Petersburg, Florida home, where 21-year-old Landy Martinez was shot and possibly tortured.
What we found out was that a number of neighbors had solicitors that had been coming to their house that morning to sell magazines. So what we had to do was to try to determine, was it legitimate that there were solicitors in the area that morning, or could this have been potential suspects?
One of the neighbors had a business card, so we're able to assign a detective to that lead.
While a detective follows up on the solicitors, another investigator makes a phone call to Yadira Guzman, Landy's roommate who called 911.
She proceeds to tell them about the relationship that our victim had with his ex-boyfriend.
They'd been in a relationship for an extended period of time, on and off, a little over a year. They were in the house for about 5 months when they decided to split, end their relationship, and Jose was told to leave the residence. It wasn't amicable, the split.
Those cameras were put in after Jose had moved out of the house. And they were actually put in because of Jose.
She explains that the breakup had set off a series of back-and-forth retaliation attempts between the ex-lovers.
There were times immediately following the relationship in which Jose had taken a car that belonged to the victim and took it to North Carolina and was purposely running red lights so that the victim could get tickets in the mail.
He was trying to punish Landy, I think, thinking that they'd think it's Landy's car and he would get the tickets.
But according to Yadira, Landy wasn't going to let Jose get the best of him.
So to get the car back, Landy tells Jose, I want to get back together, meet me at this McDonald's, and we'll get back together, and bring me the car.
Landy calls the sheriff's office and requests the deputy to come out to stand by to keep the peace. So Jose parks the vehicle. Landy gets up, goes and meets the deputy and tells him, hey, that's my vehicle. That's my ex-boyfriend. I want his stuff out of it. I'm taking it back.
The deputies confirmed that the car is registered to our victim, takes the keys.
And Landy takes all of Jose's belongings and dumps them out, and then drives the car away and leaves Jose there by himself to fend for himself. This really angered Jose.
It was a victory for Landy as he just left them there in the parking lot, and drove home. He accomplished what he wanted to, and he took control back of the situation.
The call with Yadira puts Jose on their radar. She also gives investigators another name to look into.
Our victim had recently started dating someone else. That person, his name was Jonathan. So with her providing information on how to get a hold of Jonathan, we have to now reach out to Jonathan to make sure that he's not a potential suspect.
Detectives reached Jonathan by phone at his home about an hour and a half from St. Petersburg. He details a phone call he had with Landy the night before.
Landy was repeatedly trying to assure him that everything with Jose had been completely broken off, that he was done with that relationship. He's talking with Landy, and Landy says, I want to call Jose while you're on the phone with me, and I just want you to listen in on the conversation and be assured that the relationship is over with.
It's a three-way call. You be quiet, and I will go through with Jose telling him that this is over, and you can hear it in first person. The night of this murder, around midnight, there's a phone call. He says, hey, it's over between us. Found a new person. I have a new love interest. I'm really attached to this guy. I'm very happy. And Jose says, well, I'm glad for you. Landy then tells Jose, and by the way, Jonathan's on the phone. So he blindsides him on this call.
This is like a complete shock to his system, and he's now enraged because Landy got the best of him.
Jonathan tells detectives that the call ended and he went to work.
After getting off from work, he just decided to text Landy just to make sure everything was okay, let him know that he was off work. And he received a response back from Landy that just said something to the effect of okay.
The responses he was getting from Landy were not making sense. They were very short, they were very curt.
Then Jonathan says he got blindsided.
And then he starts to get text messages back from Landy's phone saying, hey, I want to get back with Jose. Jose is the love of my life. Now this is 6 hours after the three-way call where Landy is professing his love for Jonathan and telling Jose in person he doesn't love him anymore.
And that was completely a 360 from what just happened hours earlier.
The morning after the call with Jonathan, detectives attend the autopsy.
The autopsy confirmed what we were able to see at the crime scene, that the victim had been shot twice. The shot to the head was fatal.
It also backs up another theory.
He did suffer a laceration to the forehead near between the eyes. That's consistent with being struck by the hammer. And that hammer's being in the bathroom, duct tape in the bathroom.
The autopsy confirmed that he was really tortured before he was shot and killed.
But who would commit such a heinous act? Investigators confirm that it wasn't Jonathan.
His alibi, of course, is that he was at work. It was a warehouse job. They had videos, they have a time clock, then he had coworkers.
That leaves one name on their list.
You start getting a lot of information that's pointing towards a certain person, Jose Adame.
Detectives in Pinellas County, Florida, believe that 21-year-old Landy Martinez was tortured before he was shot twice at close range. Landy's ex-boyfriend, Jose Adame, is the top suspect, but all investigators have for now is a hunch.
We haven't been able to develop any of the evidence. We don't have anything that's tying Jose to the crime scene.
They decide to go back and re-listen to the 911 call and clean up some of the audio and see if they can glean any other information about who the possible suspect was.
So what we do next is we're going to transcribe the 911 call. And we're going to document each word and each sound that we hear in that call.
They were able to hear Landy saying something to the effect of, "Stay away, Jose." That then immediately put Jose at the crime scene and involved as the perpetrator.
Was he the only one?
Whether or not there was someone else involved, that still was something they needed to figure out.
Detectives revisit the two men that neighbors reported were selling magazines just before the murder.
The company was out of California, and they hire local college kids. They drop them off in a neighborhood, have them go door to door to sell magazine subscriptions. We were able to locate them and determine what they were doing in the neighborhood and eliminate them as potential suspects.
There was nothing connecting them to the house that Landy was in. Ultimately, they were able to be excluded as suspects by the detectives.
Investigators focus on finding Jose Adame. But with no permanent address since moving out of the house with Landy, this isn't easy.
Where Jose went, it was largely a mystery.
They looked to Landy's friends for help.
We were able to identify a witness, Gail Rigg. She's a dear friend of Landy. They worked together, they were coworkers.
I met with Officer Judy. Pretty much everybody with everything that had gone on the past couple days kind of suspected Jose did it. It's like, I have a gut feeling he did it.
Gail says she has been exchanging messages with Jose in the days since Landy's death. She shows them to detectives.
She tells him, asked, have you heard about Landy? She said, yes, that he has a new boyfriend and he's moving on. She says, no, Landy was murdered last night. He said, oh, that can't be true. I just talked to him, last night.
Jose said he must have missed the news because he has been out of state.
He says, I've been here. I left Florida several days ago.
Investigators want to talk to Jose, but are cautious about hitting the road.
Rather than going up there trying to follow up on this investigation and talking to him realizing that he's a suspect in the case and now he's disappeared and we can't find him anymore, the best thing for us to do is to try to see is there another case that we can use to get him in custody.
Detectives get creative, locating an old police report from nearby High Point.
We locate a report where Jose Adame was found inside a woman's duplex in High Point. He got caught in the house. He was burglarizing it. She did not want to prosecute. We made recontact with her, and she said she did want to prosecute. So we were able to obtain an arrest warrant for burglary on an unrelated case so that we could use the U.S. Marshal Service to locate and take Jose into custody. They have a unit for tracking down fugitives, and they agreed to accept this case, and they were able to locate a possible location for Jose, which was in Hickory, North Carolina.
6 days after Landy's death, Florida detectives traveled to North Carolina.
We made contact with him inside Catawba County Jail. He's read his rights, and he agrees to give us a statement. He told us that he was in Hickory, North Carolina on the dates of the offense. You thought that you got back to North Carolina December 17th, around 10 p.m., is that correct?
Yes, it was a Saturday night.
He talked briefly about being on a phone call with Jonathan, but denied that he was ever in the area at the time that this all occurred. He really tried to portray the breakup, that is, as more of a mutual breakup, that they decided to part ways and that everything was good. They just decided to be good friends. But confronting him with the information that that was not the case, obviously he denied that and wanted to leave it as though everything was fine.
Okay, so it wasn't
We weren't
angry.
fighting, no.
Everybody got along?
Detectives play the 911 call for Jose.
Jose, it's time to tell the truth. Do you want to hear something? I want you to listen to my partner here. He's going to be playing something off of a computer for you, okay?
No, please, no.
That was Landy. Did you hear Landy screaming for his life? Now's the time to tell the truth. Let's get this behind you.
No, I need you to tell me. Is this something that got out of control? Something that was going to be innocent? Maybe even something that was going to fix things. But it got out of control. It's time, Jose.
What happened, Jose? It's time. Do you want to hear the call again? Is that a yes or no?
But no matter how hard they press, Jose refuses to budge.
He denied any knowledge in the homicide. He denied being in Pinellas County. We don't have enough to charge him with homicide at this time.
One month after Landy Martinez was tortured and killed, his ex-boyfriend, Jose Adame, is being held in a North Carolina jail on unrelated charges.
Although he did not confess to the actual murder, we knew that while we were waiting on our evidence to be developed, that he wasn't going to get away from us.
Investigators need evidence that proves Jose was involved. After weeks of trying, they are finally able to access the contents of Landy's password-protected cell phone.
When we got in the phone, I mean, we're searching the phone. We're gonna search the entire phone. It's basically a computer. Well, this one had a video on it, and it was dated the day of the homicide.
We were able to identify some video that was on there that was taken of the victim while he was inside the bathroom.
When you play the video, you actually see Landy bound. He's duct taped. You don't see his ankles, but you do see his wrists. He's duct taped. He's in the same shirt, the same underwear in the video. He's in the bathtub with the shower running on his back. He's crying, and you see his hands, so you know he doesn't have the iPhone. Someone is videotaping him. The person doesn't talk on the videotape, but Landy is crying and he's speaking in Spanish. And basically what he's saying is, I'm a horrible person, I'm terrible, Jose is great, he is the love of my life, nothing is Jose's fault. You know, these kind of statements, which make absolutely no sense for Landy to be making freely and voluntarily.
He's basically telling whomever it was holding the camera and recording this, saying something to the effect of that Jose had nothing to do with this. And right away that tells us that more than likely Jose had something to do with this.
Investigators head back to Hickory. But this time, Jose isn't the only person they want to talk to.
When they get to North Carolina, we identified a mother, identified a sister, and talked to them about, okay, when did he leave? How did he leave? When did he come back? Did anyone go with him when he left? Just trying to get as much information as we possibly could.
We go to the residence, and there's a woman walking down the street towards us, towards the house. And we say, hey, are you going to that mobile home? And she says, yeah, that's where my family is. And we say, oh, hey, listen, we're up here about Jose.
The woman identifies herself as Jose's niece. She reveals she was the one who rescued her uncle after Landy left him stranded at a Florida McDonald's.
She says, well, 2 days ago, I took a day off work and drove all the way down to Florida. Yeah. And I picked my uncle up at this house. And then I drove him all the way back home. She says, and he borrowed my mom's car and drove back to Florida. That puts him in Florida on the day of the murder. We ask, where's this vehicle at right now? And she points across the mobile home park. She says, that's my mom's car right there. Now we have the vehicle that was used to transport. There's potential for evidence to be inside that vehicle.
Detectives obtain a search warrant.
They took that car back to the local sheriff's office up there. We had our own forensic specialist there to process the car for us.
The forensic tech finds blood on the steering wheel. We also found the other side of that cotton glove in between the seat and the center console down in there.
The evidence from the vehicle is submitted for testing.
DNA takes a while for it to come back, even to this day. So DNA evidence is exciting, but it isn't now. It isn't instant. I hope we have DNA.
As detectives continue to build the case, the cell phone records come in.
Around the time of the homicides, we can actually place his phone within a 2-mile area of the crime scene.
We were able to put Landy's cell phone at the same tower that Jose's on. He said, I'm in Hickory. Well, we know he's in Florida, and they're hitting off the same tower.
And then shortly after that 911 call is made, we can track his phone now leaving that area, going eastbound on Gandy Boulevard towards Tampa and leaving the area.
And now you've established probable cause for his arrest. At least now we can formally charge him.
On February 17th, 2012, Jose Adame is charged with first-degree murder.
He wasn't going to go any further to incriminate himself. He decides to not talk anymore, and he wants a lawyer.
Over 4 years after the brutal torture and murder of Landy Martinez, his ex-boyfriend, Jose Adame, goes on trial in Pinellas County, Florida. The prosecution plays the harrowing 911 call and the video of Landy being tortured for the jury.
I've been a reporter for more than 50 years. I cannot think of a similar crime where detectives have the audio of the crime and the video of the crime. When there is an in-home murder and they've got audio and video on the cell phone and the torturing, that's incredible. I mean, that thing only happens in the movies and TV and never happens in real life, except it did here.
To plan the breaking and entering, to bind him, the knife, the hammer, this is overkill. To put him in the shower and run water on him while you're videotaping him, like, this is insane.
The state presents new evidence in the form of DNA.
The glove left inside the scene, which had Jose Adame's DNA on it, it also had Landy's DNA on it. The glove in North Carolina had Jose's DNA as well as Landy's DNA. The blood on the steering wheel belonged to Landy.
Prosecutors argue that Jose acted out of a twisted drive for vengeance that took root the day Landy left him behind in a McDonald's parking lot.
You've got the torture from an unrequited lover who is angry because he's been fooled a couple of times by Landy. It is from the McDonald's incident to the phone call.
He wasn't going to walk away. That was his motive. He wanted to take back control in one final movement, if you will, in this relationship between him and Landy. He was going to have the last word no matter what, and that included shooting and killing Landy Martinez.
But the defense claims someone else entirely is responsible.
He said, but I had nothing to do with it, and said, he's the one that shot him, he's the one that did it, it wasn't me.
The jury doesn't buy the defense's version of events. On July 15th, 2016, a verdict is returned.
Jose was convicted of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with no parole.
Jose just, in my opinion, got off easy, basically. You're gonna spend the rest of your life locked away while, an awesomely amazing person is no longer with us.
For investigators, the verdict is a victory. But Landy's final words leave a loose end they can't tie.
It's clear in the original call. They're going to kill me. They are, the contraction there. They're going to kill me. There's two perpetrators here. In this case, it's not completely solved. The case is, still being worked.
The man had no past. No family waiting for him. No friends searching for his name. No letters folded inside a pocket. No photograph tucked beneath a blanket. No diary. No records. When he finally fell into the frozen snow after weeks of relentless pursuit across one of the most unforgiving landscapes on Earth, the questions surrounding him only grew louder than the gunfire that had ended his life. Even today, nearly a century later, no one can say with certainty who he truly was. Some called him a murderer. Others called him a survivor. Many remembered him simply as the mad trapper of Rat River. But madness has a way of becoming a convenient explanation whenever people fail to understand what they are looking at. Imagine standing in the middle of the Canadian Arctic during the winter of 1932. The cold does not simply sting your skin. It invades your lungs with every breath until inhaling feels like swallowing broken glass. The wind never seems to stop. It moves across endless stretches of white with an eerie confidence, erasing footprints almost as quickly as they are made. Every tree stands motionless beneath heavy snow, every frozen river looks identical to the last, and every mistake carries the possibility of becoming your final one. Now imagine trying to disappear into that wilderness. Not for a single night. Not for 2. But for weeks. Alone. While dozens of experienced police officers, indigenous trackers who knew the land better than anyone alive, dog-sled teams, and even military aircraft searched relentlessly for you. Most people would not survive the environment. He somehow managed to outrun it. Each mile should have weakened him. Instead, every mile seemed to make him more impossible to catch. His tracks appeared where no one expected them. Sometimes they vanished altogether. Search parties followed him over frozen rivers, across mountains buried beneath snow, through forests where temperatures plunged far below zero. Every time they believed they had finally cornered him, he slipped away again, leaving behind only fresh footprints leading deeper into the endless white silence. The newspapers transformed him into something almost mythical. A phantom. A ghost. A machine that never became tired. But every legend begins with an ordinary moment. In this case, it began with a small cabin standing alone in one of the loneliest places imaginable. No one could have guessed that the rough wooden walls of that cabin would soon become the center of one of the greatest manhunts in Canadian history. Inside lived a man who rarely spoke. He did not seek conversation. He did not visit neighboring trappers. He avoided unnecessary attention with almost obsessive discipline. If another traveler appeared on the trail, he often had little to say beyond the few words required by courtesy. Those who encountered him struggled to remember anything remarkable about his face. It was as if he deliberately erased himself from the memories of others. That, perhaps, was his greatest talent. Remaining forgettable. Until the day he became impossible to ignore. When the officers of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police first approached his cabin, they were not marching into battle. Their assignment was routine. Local complaints suggested that someone had been interfering with traplines belonging to indigenous hunters. Such disputes, while serious, were not unheard of in the north. The officers expected questions. Perhaps an argument. Maybe an arrest. They did not expect war. The snow around the cabin looked untouched. Smoke drifted quietly from the chimney. Nothing suggested violence. The wilderness itself seemed asleep beneath a blanket of white. One officer stepped closer. Another called toward the cabin. There was no answer. Only silence. The kind of silence that presses against your ears until you begin hearing your own heartbeat. They waited. Still nothing. Perhaps the man simply wished to be left alone. Perhaps he was asleep. Perhaps he had already left. No one standing outside that cabin could have imagined that someone inside was watching every movement through narrow cracks in the walls, gripping a rifle with practiced hands and waiting for exactly the right moment. The first shot shattered far more than frozen wood. It shattered every assumption. The bullet exploded through the cabin wall before anyone had a chance to react. One officer collapsed into the snow. His companions threw themselves behind what little cover they could find, unable to understand how an ordinary inquiry had transformed into a deadly ambush in less than a second. From that instant onward, there would be no peaceful conversation. Only survival. Only pursuit. Only questions that would remain unanswered for generations. Who fires first instead of speaking? Who chooses isolation over surrender? Who looks at overwhelming odds and decides to fight anyway? Those questions became even stranger as the days turned into weeks. Every report from the pursuing officers seemed almost unbelievable. The fugitive crossed mountains carrying little more than essential supplies. He moved across frozen rivers that experienced travelers hesitated to approach. He navigated blizzards capable of killing healthy men in hours. He fired with startling precision whenever cornered. He wasted almost nothing. Not ammunition. Not food. Not movement. He appeared less like a desperate criminal and more like someone following a discipline learned long before arriving in the Arctic. Was he a soldier? A professional hunter? A man escaping another life hidden somewhere far beyond Canada's northern frontier? Or was every theory simply another attempt to explain someone who refused to leave behind enough evidence for certainty? Years later, investigators would examine every object recovered from his body. His clothing. His rifle. His boots. His money. Even his teeth. Every detail seemed to contradict the image of an ordinary trapper. Some clues hinted at wealth. Others hinted at military experience. Still others suggested absolutely nothing at all. It was as though every answer opened the door to two new mysteries. And perhaps that is why this story continues to fascinate historians, criminologists, writers, and ordinary listeners alike. Most true crime stories promise a destination. The detective finds the killer. The courtroom reveals the truth. Justice closes the final chapter. This story offers no such comfort. Here, the investigation solved the shooting. The pursuit ended. The man died. Yet the greatest mystery survived everyone involved. His identity. Imagine dying with your face photographed, your fingerprints recorded, your possessions catalogued, your body examined by doctors, newspapers publishing your image across the country, and still remaining anonymous. It almost sounds impossible. Yet that is exactly what happened. Long after the rifles fell silent, experts continued searching for the truth through increasingly sophisticated methods. Decades later, science would examine his DNA, tracing fragments of ancestry across continents. The results narrowed possibilities, suggested connections, and inspired entirely new theories. But certainty remained just beyond reach. Like footprints disappearing beneath fresh snow. This is not simply the story of a fugitive. It is the story of obsession. Of survival pushed beyond ordinary limits. Of fear growing inside men who slowly realized the person they were chasing might understand the wilderness better than they ever could. It is also the story of a country confronting one uncomfortable possibility. Sometimes the greatest mystery is not how someone escaped for so long. Sometimes the greatest mystery is whether anyone ever truly knew who they were chasing in the first place. Because somewhere between the frozen rivers, the abandoned cabin, the drifting snow, and the final exchange of gunfire, a man erased almost every trace of his existence. Everything except the legend. And legends rarely tell the whole truth. Long before the first shot echoed through the frozen wilderness, before newspaper headlines transformed an unknown trapper into one of Canada's greatest mysteries, there was only silence. Not the silence found in an empty room. Not the silence that follows an argument. This was a silence so vast that it seemed capable of swallowing entire lives without leaving behind a single trace. Northern Canada in the early 1930s was not simply remote. It existed almost as another world, separated from the rest of the country by thousands of miles of forests, frozen rivers, rugged mountains, and endless stretches of snow that erased every familiar landmark. Maps offered little comfort. Roads were almost non-existent. During winter, travel depended upon sled dogs, snowshoes, rivers turned into temporary highways by ice, and the knowledge carried by those who had learned to survive in the north through generations of experience. For outsiders, the landscape appeared beautiful. For those who lived there, beauty was only one side of the truth. Every sunrise carried risk. Every journey demanded preparation. Every mistake could become fatal. Temperatures frequently plunged far below -40 degrees. Metal froze against exposed skin. Breath crystallized in beards within seconds. Food hardened like stone. Fire was not a luxury but the difference between another morning and becoming another forgotten body beneath drifting snow. The wilderness did not hate those who entered it. It simply did not care whether they lived or died. Rat River lay within this immense northern frontier, flowing quietly through a region where nature dictated every decision. Small trapping cabins stood scattered across the landscape, often separated by dozens of miles. Smoke rising from a chimney did not necessarily mean companionship. It simply meant another human being had survived one more night. Life revolved around the seasons. When winter arrived, trappers checked their lines across enormous distances, searching for foxes, martens, wolves, lynx, and other animals whose pelts carried significant value in southern markets. Every trap represented labor, patience, and often a family's financial survival through another unforgiving year. Competition existed. Disagreements happened. Yet there remained an unspoken understanding among those who depended upon the land. Respect another person's trapline. Respect the wilderness. Respect the distance separating every cabin. Because in the north, neighbors might be 50 miles away, but someday they could also become the only people capable of saving your life. The indigenous Gwich'in communities understood these realities better than anyone. Their ancestors had lived alongside these rivers and forests for countless generations, reading snow, weather, wildlife, and changing seasons with remarkable precision. Their knowledge allowed explorers, traders, missionaries, and government officials to travel across regions that would otherwise have been impossible to navigate. When experienced hunters noticed something unusual, people listened. It was not paranoia. It was experience. During the summer of 1931, stories began circulating about a stranger living alone near Rat River. No one could say much about him. He appeared without ceremony. He built himself a small log cabin. He trapped animals. He kept to himself. He introduced himself as Albert Johnson. Whether that was his real name, no one could know. In frontier communities, people often accepted such introductions without demanding documents or elaborate explanations. Survival mattered more than paperwork. If a man wished to begin a new life in the wilderness, few asked what he had left behind. Still, something about him unsettled those who crossed his path. Not because he threatened them. Not because he shouted or drank or caused disturbances. Quite the opposite. He almost never spoke. Some remembered greeting him only to receive a brief nod. Others recalled conversations ending after only a sentence or two. There were no stories of laughter around campfires. No evenings spent exchanging hunting tales. No friendships. He appeared to have constructed invisible walls around himself long before building walls of timber around his cabin. Solitude itself was not unusual in the north. Many trappers preferred isolation. But isolation and secrecy were not the same thing. The difference often revealed itself through small details. Most newcomers eventually developed relationships with neighboring trappers. They traded supplies, borrowed tools, exchanged weather observations, or simply shared coffee after weeks alone. Albert Johnson did none of those things. If someone approached, he seemed eager for the encounter to end. If another trapper passed nearby, Johnson rarely invited conversation. People gradually stopped trying. The silence surrounding him grew heavier with every passing month. Then another concern emerged. Several indigenous hunters reported that traplines had been disturbed. Traps appeared moved. Others vanished altogether. Animals that should have remained where they had been caught disappeared. Such accusations carried serious weight. For families relying upon trapping income, interference threatened far more than inconvenience. It threatened survival through the coming winter. No witness claimed to have watched Johnson committing these acts. Suspicion grew because of geography, timing, and circumstance. His cabin stood within the region. He avoided everyone. He refused to explain himself. Whether guilty or innocent, his unwillingness to engage only deepened mistrust. In another town, perhaps neighbors would have gathered for discussion. Perhaps local authorities would have resolved matters within an afternoon. But this was the Arctic. Distance magnified uncertainty. Rumors traveled faster than sleds. Facts arrived much more slowly. Eventually, the complaints reached the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. To modern audiences, the arrival of police might suggest flashing lights, radios, and rapid response teams. None of that existed here. An investigation itself required planning. Officers prepared supplies, winter clothing, rifles, ammunition, food, fuel, and dog teams capable of enduring impossible distances. Every mile demanded effort. Every decision carried logistical consequences. The officers assigned to visit Johnson expected nothing extraordinary. From their perspective, they were responding to local complaints involving trapline disputes and an unusually uncooperative resident. Perhaps they would ask questions. Perhaps they would inspect the area. Perhaps they would issue warnings or make an arrest if necessary. No one packed for a siege. No one imagined they were riding toward a story that historians would still discuss nearly a century later. Meanwhile, life around Rat River continued beneath shortening autumn days. The first heavy snow buried old trails. Rivers slowly surrendered to ice. Animals adapted to another northern winter. Cabins became islands separated by endless white. Inside his own cabin, Albert Johnson prepared for the cold months ahead. Exactly what occupied his thoughts remains unknown. No diary survived. No letters explained his intentions. No trusted friend later recounted private conversations. The man existed almost entirely through the observations of others. He chopped wood. He maintained his cabin. He checked traplines. He appeared physically capable, disciplined, and methodical. Nothing suggested panic. Nothing suggested he intended to flee. Whatever secrets he carried remained locked inside a mind that never willingly shared them. That silence would soon become one of the greatest obstacles facing investigators. Because every criminal investigation begins with questions. Who? Why? How? But in this case, even before violence erupted, the simplest question proved impossible to answer. Who exactly was Albert Johnson? No birth certificate. No employment history. No military records. No confirmed relatives. No verified hometown. It was as though he had stepped out of the wilderness itself, bringing with him only a name that might not even belong to him. The stage was quietly being set. An isolated cabin. An anonymous stranger. Growing suspicion. An unforgiving landscape where escape seemed impossible and survival itself required extraordinary determination. Soon, one routine visit would transform that quiet northern frontier into the center of one of the largest and most remarkable manhunts in Canadian history. Every true crime story carries a human cost. Sometimes that cost is measured by a single life taken without warning. Sometimes it is measured by the families left waiting for someone who will never come home. In the case of the mad trapper of Rat River, the tragedy unfolded differently. Before the mystery became legendary, before newspapers turned an anonymous fugitive into a larger-than-life figure, there were men wearing the scarlet uniform of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police who believed they were simply carrying out another routine assignment. They could not have known that one of them would never see another Canadian winter, and another would spend the rest of his life carrying both physical wounds and memories that no surgeon could remove. Among those men was Constable Edgar Millen. Unlike the mysterious trapper whose past disappeared behind unanswered questions, Millen's life followed a path built on service. He had chosen a profession that demanded resilience, discipline, and an acceptance that danger often arrived without warning. The RCMP was more than a law enforcement agency. Across Canada's vast northern territories, its officers were judges, rescuers, mediators, messengers, and sometimes the only visible representatives of the government for hundreds of miles. The badge carried responsibility far beyond enforcing the law. An officer stationed in the north learned quickly that survival depended as much on patience as courage. He needed to understand weather as well as criminals, rivers as well as regulations. A poor decision could strand an entire patrol in temperatures capable of freezing exposed flesh within minutes. Every journey demanded careful planning. Every patrol became an exercise in endurance. Millen understood these realities. Those who served beside him remembered a dependable officer, someone who accepted hardship as part of the job rather than something to complain about. Long hours behind dog sleds, frozen camps, aching muscles, and endless white horizons were simply part of life. The North did not reward arrogance. It rewarded preparation, persistence, and respect. By the winter of 1931, Millen had already experienced enough of the Arctic to know that most disputes ended with conversation rather than violence. A disagreement over traplines, missing pelts, or hunting territory could certainly become heated, but firearms were usually a last resort. Communities depended upon cooperation to survive. Even those who disliked one another understood that tomorrow they might need help crossing a dangerous river or finding shelter during a blizzard. That expectation shaped the mindset of the officers preparing to visit Albert Johnson's isolated cabin. No one anticipated a battle. Another member of the patrol, Constable Alfred W. King, carried similar expectations. Like Millen, he had accepted that hardship came with the uniform. Northern policing meant sleeping outdoors, traveling through storms, and spending weeks away from civilization. The work demanded physical endurance, but perhaps even more importantly, it required emotional steadiness. Officers often found themselves making difficult decisions with little guidance beyond their own judgment. King possessed that quiet confidence. There was little reason to believe the coming days would become anything more than another difficult assignment completed before returning to the detachment. Neither man knew they were approaching the defining moment of their lives. As Christmas passed and the final days of December settled across the Arctic, daylight remained painfully short. Morning and afternoon blended together beneath a pale sky that never seemed fully awake. Smoke from campfires climbed slowly into freezing air before disappearing into silence. Dog teams rested after long journeys, their thick coats dusted with snow, while officers checked rifles, supplies, and equipment with practiced routines developed through years of northern service. Routine creates comfort. Comfort creates assumptions. Those assumptions would soon be shattered. Far away from government offices and crowded cities, the patrol prepared to make contact with a man who had refused every opportunity to cooperate. The complaints surrounding Albert Johnson were serious enough to require investigation, but they still appeared manageable. The officers carried legal authority. They carried experience. They carried confidence earned through previous assignments. What they did not carry was any understanding of the man waiting inside that isolated cabin. History often remembers violence through dramatic moments, the crack of a rifle, the collapse of a wall, the final exchange of gunfire. Yet violence begins long before the first shot. It begins with expectations colliding against reality. For Millen and King, reality would arrive in the most brutal way imaginable. The frozen landscape itself offered no warning. The trees stood motionless beneath heavy snow. The wind drifted softly across the river. The cabin appeared ordinary, almost insignificant against the enormous wilderness surrounding it. Nothing about its rough timber walls suggested that within days it would become one of the most famous cabins in Canadian history. As the patrol approached, discipline guided every movement. Distances were judged carefully. Voices remained calm. Procedures were followed. The officers had no reason to provoke unnecessary confrontation. They intended to perform their duties professionally and leave. Inside the cabin, another mind was working according to an entirely different set of expectations. No one knows exactly what Albert Johnson thought as the officers arrived. Did he believe they intended to arrest him? Did he fear exposure for something unrelated to the trapping complaints? Had he spent years preparing for precisely such a confrontation? Or had isolation slowly convinced him that every stranger represented danger? The answers died with him. All that remained were actions. Those actions would transform ordinary policemen into unwilling participants in one of Canada's greatest mysteries. The first confrontation left Alfred King fighting not only pain but survival itself. The bullet that tore through the cabin wall struck him with terrifying force, proving instantly that this would not become another peaceful investigation. In an environment where medical care existed hundreds of miles away, even surviving the wound became an extraordinary challenge. His fellow officers refused to abandon him. Across more than 100 kilometers of frozen wilderness, King was transported by dog sled through brutal winter conditions toward medical assistance. Every mile represented determination. Every hour demanded hope that the injured constable could endure the journey. The Arctic punished weakness without mercy, yet somehow King survived. His recovery would stand as one remarkable story within a much larger tragedy. For Edgar Millen, however, the worst was still waiting. When additional officers gathered to surround the cabin, confidence slowly returned. They possessed greater numbers. The suspect appeared trapped. Escape seemed impossible. The wilderness itself formed a prison with walls of ice and endless snow. Logic suggested only one ending. Sooner or later, the man inside would surrender. Instead, every assumption collapsed. Hours passed. Gunfire echoed across the frozen landscape. The cabin became less a home than a fortress. Even after explosives tore through its structure, the impossible happened. The man they believed buried beneath shattered timber emerged alive, armed, and ready to fight. In the confusion that followed, Edgar Millen found himself confronting an opponent unlike anyone the RCMP had expected to encounter. The exchange lasted only moments. Its consequences would echo for generations. Millen fell, mortally wounded in the snow he had crossed so many times during his years of service. Around him, fellow officers suddenly realized that the mission had changed forever. This was no longer an investigation into disturbed traplines. It had become the largest manhunt northern Canada had ever witnessed. News of Millen's death spread quickly despite the immense distances separating Arctic communities. Among fellow officers, the loss struck deeply. They understood better than anyone the risks carried by the badge, yet understanding danger never lessened grief when one of their own failed to return home. Behind every uniform stood parents, siblings, friends, and loved ones who knew Edgar Millen not as a newspaper headline but as a son, a companion, a man who had chosen duty over comfort. His death transformed the emotional weight of the pursuit. The officers who continued following Albert Johnson across mountains and frozen rivers were not chasing an abstract suspect anymore. They were carrying the memory of a fallen colleague with every exhausting step through the snow. The final days of December 1931 settled over the Northwest Territories beneath a sky that never seemed to brighten completely. Daylight lingered only briefly before surrendering once again to the long Arctic twilight. Frost covered every branch, every frozen shoreline, every weathered log that formed the walls of a lonely cabin near Rat River. From a distance, nothing about that cabin appeared remarkable. Thin smoke drifted from the chimney, disappearing into the pale air as though the wilderness itself were quietly breathing. Inside those rough-hewn walls sat a man who had spent months avoiding nearly every conversation with the outside world. Outside, a small group of RCMP officers prepared to complete what they believed would be another routine duty. The complaints against Albert Johnson had not disappeared after the first unsuccessful attempt to question him. His refusal to cooperate had only deepened suspicion. After obtaining the legal authority to search the cabin, the officers returned on December 31st with every expectation that the matter would soon be resolved. The journey itself had already demanded determination. The men had crossed frozen rivers, guided dog teams through deep snow, and endured temperatures capable of freezing exposed skin within moments. Their uniforms were stiff with frost. Ice clung to their scarves and eyelashes. Every breath emerged as a cloud before instantly vanishing into the wind. Still, none of them behaved like soldiers advancing toward a battlefield. Their movements remained calm, measured, professional. The cabin stood quietly ahead of them, surrounded by untouched snow that reflected the weak winter light. No voices came from inside. No movement could be seen through the small windows. The surrounding forest seemed almost unnaturally still, as if every living creature had retreated from the bitter cold. One officer called toward the cabin. His voice disappeared into the frozen air. No reply. Another call followed. Again, silence. Silence in the Arctic carries a different weight than silence anywhere else. Without traffic, machinery, or distant city sounds, even the smallest noise becomes significant. A snapping branch, a shifting gust of wind, the creak of frozen timber, each sound demands attention. That morning, however, the cabin answered only with silence. The officers exchanged brief glances. Perhaps Johnson intended to ignore them. Perhaps he hoped they would leave. Perhaps he was simply refusing to acknowledge their authority. Whatever the reason, procedure required the officers to continue. One of them moved closer toward the entrance. Boots compressed the snow with slow, deliberate steps. Every movement remained cautious, but not fearful. Nothing suggested that a rifle barrel had already been positioned behind the cabin wall. No one outside knew exactly where Johnson stood. They did not know whether he watched them through a narrow crack between the logs or through a small gap beside the window frame. They did not know how long he had been preparing for this exact moment. What happened next unfolded so quickly that later reports could only reconstruct fragments. Without warning, a rifle fired from inside the cabin. The bullet did not emerge through an open doorway. It tore directly through the wooden wall. The timber exploded into splinters. Constable Alfred W. King had almost no opportunity to react. The round struck him with devastating force, throwing him backward into the snow. For one impossible second, no one fully understood what had happened. The silence shattered into chaos. Officers dove behind trees, sleds, and whatever cover the frozen landscape could provide. More shots followed. Splinters burst from cabin walls. Snow erupted where bullets struck the ground. The routine investigation had ended forever. The officers shouted to one another over the gunfire, trying to determine King's condition while preventing anyone else from becoming exposed. Every movement carried enormous risk. The open snow surrounding the cabin offered almost no protection. Inside, Johnson revealed nothing. No demands. No warnings. No attempt at negotiation. Only rifle fire. King lay wounded, fighting to remain conscious while the freezing ground beneath him threatened to become as dangerous as the bullet itself. Blood darkened the white snow around his body, creating a shocking contrast against the endless landscape of ice. His fellow officers faced an impossible choice. Continue engaging the armed man inside the cabin, or rescue their injured colleague. Duty left little room for hesitation. Under constant danger, they managed to pull King away from the line of fire. Every yard gained felt painfully slow. Bullets continued striking nearby trees and frozen earth, reminding everyone that Johnson remained determined to resist. The wounded constable required immediate medical treatment. Yet immediate treatment did not exist. The nearest proper medical assistance lay more than 100 kilometers away through some of the harshest winter terrain imaginable. Dog sleds became ambulances. The race against time began. Wrapped against the cold as carefully as circumstances allowed, King was placed upon a sled for the long journey south. Every bump across frozen rivers and uneven trails risked worsening his injuries. Every passing hour increased the danger posed by blood loss, shock, and relentless Arctic temperatures. His survival would later be considered remarkable. Back at the cabin, however, the confrontation had only begun. News of the shooting spread rapidly through RCMP channels despite the immense distances involved. Reinforcements were organized. Additional officers prepared for a mission unlike anything they had anticipated only days earlier. The objective had changed. No longer were they attempting to question an uncooperative trapper. They were confronting an armed man who had already attempted to kill a police officer. As more personnel arrived, confidence slowly returned. Numbers favored the police. The cabin remained isolated. Deep snow surrounded every direction. Escape appeared nearly impossible. The officers established positions around the structure, believing patience would eventually accomplish what conversation had failed to achieve. Food inside the cabin had to be limited. Firewood could not last forever. Sooner or later, exhaustion, hunger, or common sense would force Johnson outside. Hours passed. Nothing happened. The man inside displayed extraordinary discipline. No reckless bursts of gunfire. No desperate attempts to flee. Only occasional rifle shots reminding the officers that he remained alert and ready. The siege stretched onward beneath relentless cold. Night arrived early. Darkness swallowed the surrounding forest. Temperatures continued falling. The officers rotated positions, stamping frozen boots against the snow to restore circulation while never allowing themselves to relax completely. Inside the cabin, Johnson somehow endured. Exactly what occupied his thoughts during those long hours remains forever unknown. Did he expect rescue? Did he believe he could escape? Had he already accepted death? History offers no answers. Only consequences. Eventually, RCMP commanders concluded that waiting indefinitely served little purpose. They decided to force the confrontation to an end. Explosives were prepared. The intention seemed straightforward. Destroy the cabin. Remove Johnson's protection. Compel surrender. The charge detonated with tremendous force. Logs burst apart. The roof collapsed inward. Clouds of snow, smoke, shattered timber, and debris filled the air. For several moments, visibility disappeared completely. The officers waited. Surely no one could survive beneath that collapse. As drifting smoke slowly cleared, the broken remains of the cabin appeared almost lifeless. Then movement. A figure emerged from the wreckage. Not crawling. Not surrendering. Standing. Rifle in hand. The sight stunned everyone present. Johnson fired almost immediately. The officers answered with their own rifles. Gunfire echoed violently across the frozen valley as both sides searched desperately for cover among shattered logs and snowbanks. The carefully planned siege dissolved into a desperate firefight. During those frantic moments, Constable Edgar Millen found himself exposed. One accurately placed shot struck him. He collapsed into the snow. The surrounding officers rushed to return fire while attempting to reach their fallen colleague, but the intensity of Johnson's resistance made every movement dangerous. Millen's injuries proved catastrophic. Within minutes, the investigation into a trapline dispute had become something far larger. A police officer lay dying. Another had already been gravely wounded. The suspect remained alive. Even more astonishing, Johnson refused to surrender despite overwhelming odds. Then, amid confusion and drifting smoke, he disappeared. The officers struggled to believe what had happened. A man who should have been trapped inside a destroyed cabin had escaped into one of the most unforgiving wildernesses on Earth. He left behind shattered logs, scattered equipment, spent cartridges, and the body of Constable Edgar Millen. Ahead of him stretched thousands of square miles of frozen rivers, dense forests, mountains, and endless snow. Most men would have viewed that landscape as certain death. Albert Johnson saw it as his only chance. The largest manhunt in Canadian history had begun. When the last echoes of gunfire faded into the Arctic wilderness, an uneasy silence settled over the shattered remains of the cabin. Only moments earlier, the small structure had stood as the center of an armed standoff. Now it was little more than broken logs, splintered beams, scattered supplies, and drifting smoke that slowly disappeared into the bitter northern air. Snow continued to fall lightly, almost indifferent to what had just occurred. Nature had already begun the slow process of covering every sign of violence. The officers remained frozen in place for several seconds, not because of the temperature but because of disbelief. Nothing had unfolded according to expectation. The explosives had been intended to force surrender. Instead, they had become the opening act of an even greater disaster. Constable Edgar Millen lay mortally wounded. Several officers rushed toward him despite the possibility that more shots might follow. Every instinct told them to reach their fellow officer first. Their training demanded composure, but grief moved faster than discipline. Millen's uniform contrasted sharply against the snow beneath him. His breathing had become shallow. Around him, the men who had traveled beside him across frozen rivers and endless forests now found themselves powerless to reverse what had happened. In the north, medical care could not arrive within minutes. There were no ambulances racing through nearby streets, no surgeons waiting just beyond the horizon. Only distance. Only cold. Only acceptance that some wounds could not be survived. While attention focused on the fallen officer, another realization slowly spread across the scene. Albert Johnson was gone. The cabin had been surrounded. Every officer had believed escape impossible. Yet somewhere amid the explosion, smoke, collapsing timbers, and confusion, the mysterious trapper had slipped away. The discovery was almost impossible to accept. Officers quickly searched the immediate area, moving cautiously through deep snow while scanning every tree line and frozen ridge. At first there appeared to be nothing. Then someone noticed the faint impressions leading away from the destroyed cabin. Footprints. Fresh. Only one set. The tracks disappeared toward the wilderness with astonishing confidence, as though the man making them had never doubted his route. There was no sign of panic. No evidence of random wandering. Each footprint maintained a deliberate rhythm. Even before the pursuit resumed, those tracks revealed something important. Johnson had escaped under extraordinary pressure without losing his sense of direction. Experienced outdoorsmen examined the prints carefully. They estimated the weight being carried, the depth of each step, the spacing between footprints, and the speed suggested by the trail. Years of living in the north had taught them to read snow much like others read handwriting. The conclusions surprised them. Johnson was moving quickly. Faster than anyone expected from a man who had just survived a firefight, escaped a collapsing cabin, and fled into temperatures approaching 40 degrees below zero. The officers searched the ruined cabin for anything that might explain the man they were chasing. The destruction made the task difficult. Broken furniture lay scattered beneath fallen logs. Cooking utensils rested among splintered timber. Personal belongings appeared remarkably few. There were no letters revealing family connections. No journals documenting private thoughts. No photographs tucked beneath blankets or hidden inside boxes. No documents capable of confirming his identity. It was as though the cabin belonged to someone determined to leave behind as little of himself as possible. Every item recovered seemed practical rather than personal. Tools. Basic supplies. Equipment needed for trapping and survival. Nothing more. For investigators, the absence of evidence became evidence itself. Most people carry reminders of who they are. A family photograph. A letter from home. A keepsake with sentimental value. Albert Johnson appeared to possess none of those things. If he had once lived another life somewhere beyond the Arctic, he had carefully severed every visible connection to it. Outside, the snow continued to preserve the story of his escape. The tracks crossed open ground before entering thicker forest. Occasionally they disappeared beneath drifting snow only to emerge again farther ahead. Each discovery renewed the determination of the pursuing officers while simultaneously increasing their respect for the fugitive's skill. This was no desperate man stumbling blindly into the wilderness. He understood the country around him. He selected routes that balanced speed with concealment. He avoided unnecessary effort. He wasted remarkably little energy. Even the officers' sled dogs seemed to struggle against the conditions more than the man they pursued. News of the confrontation spread rapidly through RCMP headquarters and neighboring settlements. Reports described an officer killed, another seriously wounded, a suspect who had escaped impossible odds, and an active manhunt stretching across hundreds of miles of Arctic terrain. The scale of the investigation changed almost overnight. Additional officers prepared to travel north. Experienced guides offered assistance. Indigenous trackers whose knowledge of snow and landscape had been earned through generations became increasingly valuable. Every new participant carried the same question. Who exactly was this man? The answer remained frustratingly out of reach. The destroyed cabin yielded almost nothing capable of identifying its owner. The name Albert Johnson existed, but there was no reliable proof that it belonged to the man who had lived there. Investigators searched available records. No clear match appeared. Every attempt to connect him to another community seemed to dissolve into uncertainty. The mystery surrounding his identity began growing almost as quickly as the legend surrounding his escape. Meanwhile, practical concerns demanded immediate attention. The pursuit could not wait. Fresh tracks would not remain fresh forever. Wind threatened to erase valuable evidence. Snowfall could transform a clear trail into an empty white landscape within hours. The officers understood that every delay increased Johnson's chances of disappearing forever. Dog teams were prepared. Supplies were loaded. Routes were planned using maps that often contained more blank spaces than useful information. The Arctic offered countless places for one determined man to hide. Yet those same vast distances also threatened to destroy anyone attempting to cross them. For the pursuers, success depended upon endurance as much as investigation. Every camp established during the chase required chopping firewood, melting snow for drinking water, feeding exhausted dogs, repairing damaged equipment, and remaining alert despite overwhelming fatigue. Sleep came in brief intervals. Cold became a constant companion. Still, the memory of Edgar Millen gave the mission renewed purpose. This was no longer merely about finding a fugitive. It had become a promise to bring an end to the violence that had begun beside a lonely cabin at Rat River. As investigators reconstructed the events surrounding the siege, another unsettling observation emerged. Johnson had displayed remarkable marksmanship. His shots had been deliberate rather than reckless. He appeared capable of firing accurately under extraordinary pressure. Combined with his calm escape, this suggested experience beyond that of an ordinary trapper. Speculation quietly began among the officers. Perhaps he had military training. Perhaps he had hunted dangerous game for years. Perhaps he had learned survival somewhere even harsher than northern Canada. No one could prove any theory. Yet each mile of the pursuit seemed to reinforce the same conclusion. They were chasing someone exceptionally capable. The cabin itself slowly disappeared beneath fresh snow, becoming just another scar absorbed by the immense wilderness. Months earlier it had been a place of solitude. Now it stood in memory as the location where an unknown man transformed from a quiet recluse into the most wanted fugitive in Canada. The investigation had uncovered almost nothing about his past. Instead, it had revealed something far more troubling. The man had entered the North without leaving a history. Now he had vanished into it without leaving certainty behind. For the officers preparing to follow those fading footprints across frozen rivers and towering mountains, the greatest discovery was not hidden beneath the collapsed cabin. It was the realization that every assumption they had carried into the investigation had been wrong. The wilderness was no longer simply the setting of the case. It had become an active participant, protecting the fugitive, concealing evidence, and challenging every step of the men determined to bring him to justice. Ahead of them lay hundreds of miles of snow. Behind them remained only a destroyed cabin, unanswered questions, and the beginning of a legend that would survive long after every footprint had disappeared. By the time the first search parties disappeared into the endless white horizon, the case had already become something far larger than anyone inside the Royal Canadian Mounted Police had imagined. What had begun as an investigation into complaints about disturbed traplines had transformed into a relentless pursuit across one of the harshest environments on Earth. The death of Constable Edgar Millen changed everything. The objective was no longer simply to locate an uncooperative trapper. It was to capture a man who had opened fire on police officers, survived a siege, escaped from a destroyed cabin, and vanished into a wilderness where even experienced outdoorsmen struggled to stay alive. The Arctic quickly became the investigators' greatest obstacle. Unlike a city, there were no streets to block, no train stations to monitor, no witnesses waiting at every corner. There were only frozen rivers stretching toward distant mountains, forests buried beneath heavy snow, and valleys where a single snowfall could erase every sign of human movement. Yet the wilderness also left clues. Every footprint became evidence. Every broken branch suggested direction. Every abandoned campsite told a small part of the story. Experienced indigenous trackers joined the pursuit, bringing generations of knowledge that no handbook could teach. They could study the depth of a footprint and estimate how heavily a man was loaded. They could examine disturbed snow and determine whether someone had rested briefly or merely paused to observe the landscape. Tiny details invisible to others became valuable information. Even with their expertise, Johnson continued to surprise everyone. His trail rarely followed the easiest routes. Instead, it crossed frozen rivers where the wind erased tracks more quickly. It climbed steep ridges that slowed the pursuing dog teams. Sometimes the footprints seemed to vanish completely, forcing trackers to spread across wide areas until the trail appeared again miles away. Again and again, Johnson demonstrated that he understood both the landscape and the psychology of those following him. Whenever investigators believed they had narrowed the distance, they discovered that he had already anticipated their approach. The pursuit became as much a contest of endurance as intelligence. Every officer carried heavy winter clothing, weapons, food, ammunition, sleeping equipment, and emergency supplies. The dog teams required constant care. Camps had to be established before darkness and dismantled before sunrise. Firewood had to be collected despite exhausting days of travel. Every frozen river crossing involved careful judgment. A single mistake could plunge men or dogs into icy water, ending the pursuit immediately. Johnson carried remarkably little. That realization disturbed the investigators. Most fugitives accumulated burdens. Extra food. Additional clothing. Supplies gathered in panic. Johnson appeared to travel with only what was absolutely necessary. His footprints suggested confidence rather than desperation. Reports arriving at RCMP headquarters became increasingly extraordinary. Newspapers across Canada eagerly published updates describing the mysterious fugitive who continued escaping larger and larger search parties. Public fascination grew with every passing day. Readers hundreds of miles away followed the pursuit as though reading an adventure novel, while the officers involved experienced only fatigue, frustration, and mounting pressure. The press quickly began constructing theories. Perhaps the fugitive had military experience. Perhaps he had served as a sniper during the First World War. Others suggested he might be a professional hunter from Alaska or Scandinavia. Some imagined him as an escaped criminal hiding beneath a false name. Every theory attempted to explain one undeniable fact. Ordinary men did not survive the Arctic this way. Inside the investigation, however, speculation could not replace evidence. Investigators returned repeatedly to the question of identity. Who was Albert Johnson? Searches through available records produced little certainty. The name itself proved frustratingly common. No confirmed relatives stepped forward. No former employers identified him. No community claimed him as a missing resident. It seemed almost impossible. A man had lived among others for months. He had purchased supplies. He had built a cabin. He had interacted, however briefly, with neighboring trappers. Yet no one truly knew him. The absence of information gradually became one of the investigation's greatest mysteries. Each passing day generated additional questions instead of answers. How had he acquired such exceptional shooting skills? Why had he chosen one of the most isolated regions in North America? Why had he refused even the simplest conversation with authorities? Most importantly, why had he responded to a lawful search warrant with deadly violence? No clear motive emerged. Investigators considered whether Johnson feared arrest for another crime committed elsewhere. If so, no supporting evidence appeared. Others wondered whether prolonged isolation had affected his judgment. Months spent almost entirely alone in the wilderness can alter even experienced trappers. Loneliness changes perception. Silence becomes routine. Small concerns sometimes grow into overwhelming fears. Yet Johnson's actions did not resemble panic. His decisions appeared calculated. His escape routes demonstrated planning. His marksmanship remained controlled. Rather than behaving irrationally, he displayed remarkable discipline. That contradiction puzzled everyone. As the chase continued, technology entered the investigation in a way almost unprecedented for northern policing. Aircraft were deployed to assist the search, marking one of the earliest occasions in Canadian history when airplanes played a significant role in pursuing a criminal suspect across remote terrain. Pilots scanned endless fields of white from above, searching for movement impossible to detect from the ground. Smoke from a campfire. Fresh tracks crossing frozen rivers. A solitary figure moving through open valleys. The Arctic, however, refused to cooperate. Snowstorms reduced visibility to almost nothing. Cloud cover concealed entire mountain ranges. Even from the air, one man could disappear astonishingly easily. The planes expanded the search. They did not solve it. On the ground, morale shifted constantly. Some days investigators believed capture was imminent. Fresh tracks suggested Johnson remained only hours ahead. Then another storm arrived. The trail disappeared. The pursuit effectively restarted. Physical exhaustion accumulated relentlessly. Faces became weathered by wind and frost. Beards filled with ice crystals. Gloves stiffened from repeated exposure to snow. The officers pushed forward because stopping meant allowing the fugitive additional distance. Among themselves, conversations increasingly reflected reluctant admiration for the man they pursued. Respect did not lessen the seriousness of his crimes, but skill could not be ignored. He selected campsites with remarkable care. He avoided unnecessary fires whenever possible. He conserved ammunition. He crossed terrain that many experienced travelers would have avoided entirely. Every decision suggested knowledge gained through years rather than months. The investigation slowly evolved into a psychological contest. What would Johnson do next? Would he continue north? Attempt to cross mountain ranges? Seek another isolated cabin? Circle back behind the search parties? Each possibility demanded resources. Each incorrect prediction wasted precious time and energy. Perhaps most frustrating of all, Johnson almost never left behind personal evidence. No written messages. No attempts to communicate. No demands. No explanations. The investigators understood almost everything about how he moved. They understood almost nothing about why. As January turned toward February, the pursuit entered its second month. Most fugitives would have surrendered long before. Food would diminish. Energy would collapse. Hope would fade. Johnson continued moving. The wilderness that should have destroyed him instead appeared to protect him. Among the officers, one realization became impossible to ignore. This case would not end through routine investigative methods. There would be no confession. No helpful witness. No forgotten document revealing the suspect's identity. The only path toward answers lay somewhere ahead, hidden beyond another frozen river, another mountain ridge, another line of footprints stretching across the snow. Until the pursuit itself reached its conclusion, the investigation remained suspended between certainty and mystery. They knew who they were chasing. They did not know who he truly was. That distinction would haunt the case long after the final shot was fired. For weeks, the pursuit through the Arctic had felt like chasing a shadow across an endless white ocean. Every time the Royal Canadian Mounted Police believed they had closed the distance, the landscape itself seemed to erase their certainty. Snowstorms buried tracks. Frozen rivers redirected movement. Forests swallowed footprints whole. Yet beneath that chaos, one thing remained consistent: Albert Johnson was still ahead of them, still moving, still alive. Then, slowly, the pattern began to change. It started with something almost too small to matter at first. A set of footprints that did not vanish as quickly as expected. They appeared more defined, deeper in places, as if the man making them was beginning to feel the weight of exhaustion. The spacing between steps became slightly irregular. Not enough to suggest collapse, but enough to suggest strain. For men who had been tracking him across hundreds of miles, these subtle changes felt like the first real sign that the Arctic was finally demanding payment. The officers moved with renewed urgency. Every mile gained now carried a different emotional weight. This was no longer an abstract pursuit across impossible terrain. It was becoming tangible. Real. Close. Reports from multiple tracking teams began to align. Johnson's path was no longer as erratic as before. Instead of sharp deviations and sudden directional changes, his movement started to follow more predictable geography. River valleys. Natural corridors through mountain ranges. Routes that conserved energy rather than outmaneuvering pursuers. To experienced trackers, this shift suggested something important was happening. Fatigue. Even in the unforgiving north, no human body could remain untouched forever. The Arctic does not negotiate. It does not yield to determination. It slowly strips away everything unnecessary until only survival remains. For weeks, Johnson had moved through this environment with almost unnatural efficiency. But efficiency still required fuel. Strength still required rest. And every night spent exposed to sub-zero temperatures left a mark, whether visible or not. The pursuit tightened. Dog teams advanced with greater coordination, covering wider areas in search patterns designed to anticipate rather than react. Air support continued when weather permitted, scanning valleys that stretched like frozen corridors between mountains. On the ground, indigenous trackers studied the snow with increasing confidence, noticing that the clarity of Johnson's trail was changing. Earlier in the chase, his footprints often seemed almost deliberately deceptive, as though he understood how to confuse those following him. Now, deception was no longer the dominant characteristic. Instead, there was economy. Straight lines where previously there had been evasive curves. Rest points that were slightly longer than before. Signs of hesitation where once there had been none. One experienced tracker reportedly remarked that the man was no longer moving like someone who believed he could outrun the pursuit indefinitely. He was moving like someone choosing where to be caught. That idea unsettled the officers. Because if Johnson was choosing anything at all, it meant he still retained control of the situation. Days passed, and the terrain began to shift. The endless uniformity of the deep Arctic slowly gave way to more varied geography. Narrow valleys opened into broader spaces. The wind patterns changed. Snow accumulation became uneven. In these subtle environmental transitions, both hunter and hunted were forced to adapt. Johnson's trail became more visible. And more desperate. There were moments where the footprints showed sudden bursts of speed followed by longer pauses, as if the fugitive was pushing himself forward only to be forced into recovery immediately afterward. At one point, the trail suggested he had stopped for an extended period, far longer than his previous habits indicated. Whether he was injured, exhausted, or simply recalculating his options remained unknown. What was clear, however, was that the psychological balance of the chase was shifting. For weeks, the RCMP had been reacting to a man who always seemed one step ahead. Now, for the first time, they were beginning to anticipate him. This shift created urgency within the ranks. Messages were exchanged more frequently. Teams adjusted their positions. The coordination between ground units and aerial observers improved. Everyone understood that in this phase of the pursuit, hesitation could mean losing him again entirely. Then came the moment that changed everything. A fresh trail was discovered near a narrowing valley where wind patterns naturally funneled movement through a confined corridor. The footprints were unmistakably recent. The snow had not yet had time to soften their edges. There was no sign of heavy snowfall since their creation. Johnson had passed through only hours earlier. For the first time since the pursuit began, the distance between hunter and hunted was no longer measured in days. It was measured in hours. The realization spread quickly through the teams. Exhaustion was still present, but it was now accompanied by something sharper. Focus. Every officer understood that they were approaching a critical threshold. One final stretch of terrain where the fugitive would either be intercepted or disappear once more into the vastness of the north. The valley ahead became the focal point of the entire operation. Johnson, unaware of how close the pursuit had become, continued moving through terrain that now worked against him as much as it worked for him. The same geography that once offered protection was becoming a channel, guiding his movement into increasingly predictable routes. Snow conditions varied in ways that made travel more physically demanding. Deep patches slowed progress. Hard-crusted sections created instability. Every step required more effort than the last. Behind him, the pursuit condensed. What had once been a wide, dispersed search operation became a concentrated push forward. Multiple teams aligned toward the same region. Communication increased in intensity. The coordination between sled teams and aerial observation reached its peak efficiency. The breakthrough was no longer theoretical. It was unfolding. Still, Johnson did not stop. Even in weakened condition, he continued to move with the same survival instinct that had carried him through the entire ordeal. But the wilderness was beginning to impose limits. His earlier advantage, speed combined with unpredictability, was diminishing. Fatigue narrowed his options. Terrain restricted his choices. The Arctic, once a vast ally of concealment, was becoming a funnel directing him toward confrontation. As the day progressed, signs of proximity intensified. Fresh disturbances in snow. Recently broken branches. Subtle traces indicating rapid movement under pressure. The trail no longer felt like a puzzle spread across impossible distances. It felt like a path leading somewhere specific. Toward an endpoint. By late afternoon, conditions became critical. Weather shifted slightly, reducing visibility but not enough to halt movement entirely. The air carried a sharp stillness that often precedes major weather changes in the north. Even experienced officers understood that time itself was becoming a factor. If Johnson reached more complex terrain under worsening weather, the opportunity to intercept him could vanish again. That possibility drove the final push. Every available team moved toward convergence. The pursuit, once fragmented across hundreds of miles, now focused on a narrowing zone where all indicators suggested Johnson had to pass. The breakthrough was no longer just about finding him. It was about reaching him before the wilderness swallowed him again. And somewhere ahead, moving through a landscape that had protected him for far too long, Albert Johnson was no longer just a ghost in the snow. He was a man running out of ground. By the time the final confrontation approached, the Arctic no longer felt like an endless wilderness to the men pursuing Albert Johnson. It had become a narrowing corridor of inevitability, a place where every decision made by both hunter and hunted was slowly funneled toward a single outcome. Weeks of exhaustion, frozen nights, and relentless tracking had stripped the pursuit down to its rawest form. There was no longer uncertainty about whether Johnson would be found. The only question remaining was what state he would be in when that moment finally arrived. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police had learned to read the land with painful precision. Every subtle change in snow density, every disturbed patch of frost, every irregularity in the wind-swept surface told a fragment of the story. Johnson's movement was no longer a mystery scattered across vast distances. It had condensed into a line of behavior that could be followed with increasing confidence. The trail no longer vanished for days at a time. It lingered. It spoke. And it led toward Eagle River. The terrain in this region was different from the earlier stretches of the pursuit. The mountains tightened into more defined passages. Valleys became narrower. The wind behaved differently, moving in stronger, more directional currents that funneled both sound and movement through predictable channels. For the first time since the chase began, the environment itself no longer seemed entirely on Johnson's side. The officers understood what this meant. If he was going to be caught, it would happen here. The final approach was not a single coordinated charge but a tightening formation. Teams converged from multiple directions, guided by the most recent confirmed tracks. Dog sleds moved with urgency that had not been present in earlier stages of the pursuit. Fatigue was still present in every muscle, every breath, every frost-covered beard, but it was now overshadowed by anticipation. Somewhere ahead, Johnson was still moving. But slower now. More controlled. More constrained by the land itself. The snow told the story before anyone saw him. The spacing of footprints indicated strain. The depth suggested heavier reliance on uneven footing. Occasional pauses appeared where before there had been uninterrupted movement. The man who once seemed to glide through the Arctic with almost unnatural efficiency was now forced into moments of hesitation. The wilderness had not defeated him yet. But it had begun to demand repayment. As the teams advanced, Communication between them increased in urgency. The coordination was no longer exploratory. It was tactical. Each group understood their role in closing the distance. The objective had narrowed to interception, containment, and final confrontation. There was no longer any expectation of negotiation. The memory of Edgar Millen remained present in every decision. This was no longer just a pursuit. It was an accounting. Johnson, however, continued to demonstrate the same instincts that had kept him alive through months of pursuit. Even in weakened condition, he selected routes that minimized exposure. He avoided open ridges where possible. He favored broken terrain where movement could be concealed. He adjusted his path whenever environmental conditions shifted. But adaptation has limits. And the Arctic, for all its vastness, eventually compresses every possibility into fewer and fewer options. As evening approached, the convergence accelerated. Reports indicated that multiple tracking units were closing in on the same region. The gap between sighting and contact had reduced dramatically. What once had been a pursuit measured in days was now measured in hours, and then in minutes. The snow itself seemed to change character. Wind carried sharper edges. Visibility fluctuated in unstable patterns. The silence between gusts felt heavier, as if the environment itself was holding its breath. Then, near Eagle River, the trail became unmistakably fresh. There was no longer ambiguity in interpretation. The footprints were recent enough that frost had not yet softened their edges. The snow still held the shape of each step with clarity that left no room for doubt. Johnson had passed through this area very recently, and he was still ahead, still within reach. The officers moved forward with renewed intensity. Every movement now carried the weight of finality. The terrain opened slightly into a space where visibility improved just enough to allow coordinated positioning. This was where the pursuit had been leading all along, though no one could have known it with certainty until now. The geography itself had guided both sides into the same narrowing space. Johnson was no longer being followed across the wilderness. He was being enclosed by it. And then it happened. The first confirmed sighting came not as a dramatic moment of recognition, but as a brief interruption in the continuity of snow and distance. A figure moving between trees. A shape too deliberate to be mistaken for anything else. The confirmation was immediate. The man they had pursued across hundreds of miles of frozen terrain was finally within view. The final pursuit began without hesitation. Johnson reacted instantly, demonstrating that even in exhaustion, instinct remained intact. He moved toward cover, using terrain features with practiced awareness. The officers responded in kind, shifting positions to prevent escape routes. The encounter unfolded not as a single clash but as a rapid sequence of movements dictated by geography, timing, and survival instinct. Gunfire erupted across the snow-covered landscape. There was no ceremony to it. No pause for consideration. Only immediate reaction from both sides. The Arctic, which had long served as silent witness to the entire pursuit, now echoed with the final stage of confrontation. Johnson fought with the same controlled precision that had defined his actions from the beginning. Even under pressure, his movements remained purposeful. But the exhaustion that had been building for weeks was no longer something he could compensate for. The environment that once provided him endless escape routes now limited his options to a shrinking set of possibilities. The officers advanced methodically, closing space while maintaining pressure. Every movement was calculated. Every position chosen with awareness of both terrain and risk. There was no longer confusion, only execution of a plan shaped by months of pursuit. At the center of it all, Johnson reached the limit of his endurance. The exact sequence of final moments has been reconstructed through reports, terrain analysis, and surviving accounts, but what remains consistent is the inevitability of it. The man who had once moved like a phantom through the Arctic was now physically constrained by exhaustion and geography. The confrontation ended in a final exchange that brought the pursuit to its conclusion. Johnson fell in the snow near Eagle River. The silence that followed was immediate and absolute. No further movement came from his position. No attempt at escape remained. The officers approached carefully, still conditioned by weeks of expecting sudden resistance, but none came. The man who had defied pursuit across one of the harshest environments on Earth was no longer able to continue. The pursuit was over. What remained was the aftermath. As the realization settled across the scene, the emotional weight of the entire investigation came into focus. Months of pursuit, loss, exhaustion, and uncertainty had reached their endpoint. Constable Edgar Millant's death, Alfred King's survival, and the collective strain carried by every officer involved now converged into a single moment of resolution. Yet even in conclusion, there was no clarity about the man at the center of it all. When the body was examined, details emerged that only deepened the mystery. Personal items were discovered that suggested a life more complex than that of an ordinary trapper. Money was found in significant amounts. A carefully maintained watch. Physical condition that reflected unexpected care in personal maintenance. Even his teeth, preserved in unusually good condition for someone living in such isolation, raised questions about his past life and origins. None of it answered the central question. Who was he? No documents identified him conclusively. No family came forward to claim him. No record definitively placed him within a known community. The name Albert Johnson remained attached to him, but whether it had ever been real could not be confirmed. In the end, justice in the conventional sense felt incomplete. The law had ended the pursuit. The man had been brought down. The violence had ceased. But understanding had not been achieved. The case closed operationally, but not intellectually. It became something else entirely in the years that followed. A story not just of crime and pursuit, but of identity lost in the vastness of the North, where a man could live, fight, and die without ever fully revealing who he was. The justice delivered that day ended the chase. But it did not end the mystery. When the pursuit ended near Eagle River and the snow finally settled over the place where Albert Johnson fell, there was no sense of triumph that often accompanies the conclusion of a manhunt. Instead, there was only a quiet heaviness that spread through the men who had spent weeks chasing him across the Arctic. The silence that followed the final confrontation felt different from the silence of the wilderness they had grown accustomed to. This silence carried memory, exhaustion, and the lingering presence of everything that had happened to bring them to that point. The officers who stood there understood immediately that the story would not end simply because the man was gone. In many ways, what came after would prove even more difficult to resolve than the pursuit itself. The body lying in the snow was no longer a threat, no longer a fugitive, no longer a mystery in motion. But it had become something else entirely. It had become the center of questions that no longer had the urgency of survival behind them, only the slow and persistent demand for understanding. As arrangements were made to recover and transport the remains, attention shifted to the details that might explain who this man had been. Every item recovered was examined with care. Clothing, tools, personal effects, and even the smallest fragments of belongings were treated not as evidence of guilt or innocence, but as possible fragments of identity. Yet the more carefully investigators studied what was left behind, the more elusive the truth became. There was no simple narrative waiting to be uncovered. Nothing that clearly pointed toward a known criminal background or an obvious origin. Instead, there were contradictions. The presence of money suggested access to resources that did not align with the image of a struggling solitary trapper. A watch, well kept and functional, implied a concern for time and order that felt almost out of place in the harsh randomness of Arctic survival. His physical condition, particularly his dental health, suggested care received at some point in his life that did not fit the assumptions made about a man living entirely cut off from civilization. Each detail widened the gap between what people expected him to be and what he appeared to have been. Back among the officers, reflection began to replace action. The pursuit had demanded everything from them physically and mentally. Many had entered it believing they were dealing with a stubborn, possibly dangerous trapper who had made a series of violent choices. They left it having confronted something far more complex. The memory of Constable Edgar Millen remained central in their thoughts, not as a statistic of duty, but as a reminder of how quickly routine can collapse into irreversible consequence in the North. Constable Alfred King's survival stood in contrast to Millant's death, and together their experiences became part of the same story that would be retold for decades. King's journey through injury and evacuation across frozen wilderness became a symbol of endurance under conditions that few could imagine. Millant's loss became a symbol of the cost of underestimating the unpredictable nature of isolation and human behavior in extreme environments. Neither outcome felt separate from the other. They were both shaped by the same sequence of events, the same cabin, the same man. As official reports were compiled, the case began its transition from active investigation to historical record. The RCMP documented the sequence of events in detail, recording movements, engagements, timelines, and observations from every available source. Yet even within these structured reports, uncertainty persisted. The documentation could describe what happened with precision, but it could not resolve the deeper question that continued to surface in every summary. Who exactly had Albert Johnson been? The name itself began to feel increasingly unstable as time passed. There were no confirmed records tying it to a birth certificate, no immigration documents, no employment history that could be reliably connected to the man found at Eagle River. Attempts to trace his identity backward through conventional means gradually reached dead ends. Each path that seemed promising eventually dissolved into ambiguity. Over the years that followed, researchers, journalists, and historians returned to the case repeatedly. New theories emerged and faded. Some suggested he may have been a European immigrant with a carefully concealed past. Others believed he might have been someone deliberately erasing his identity to escape an unknown history. Later scientific efforts, including genetic analysis conducted decades after the events, introduced possible regional links that pointed toward Scandinavian ancestry, but even these findings could not produce a definitive name or personal history. The man remained statistically present but personally absent. In popular memory, however, he became something else. The events at Rat River were retold in books, documentaries, and dramatizations that attempted to bring structure to what remained fundamentally uncertain. Each retelling emphasized different aspects of the story. Some focused on the intensity of the pursuit. Others highlighted the extreme conditions of the Arctic. Some explored the psychology of isolation, while others framed the case as a reflection of early 20th century frontier law enforcement. But beneath all interpretations, the same unresolved core remained. A man had lived alone in one of the harshest environments in the world. He had resisted authority with unexpected intensity. He had survived a prolonged pursuit that pushed both him and his pursuers to their limits. And in the end, he had died without revealing who he truly was. That absence of identity became the defining feature of his legacy. For the officers involved, time gradually transformed the memory of the case. The immediacy of pursuit faded, replaced by reflection. The Arctic landscape, once associated with urgency and danger, became in memory a place of stark beauty and unforgiving neutrality. They remembered the cold, the exhaustion, the long nights of movement across frozen terrain, but they also remembered the strange clarity that comes only when survival becomes the only concern. The story of Albert Johnson slowly moved beyond the boundaries of law enforcement history and into something closer to folklore. Not because it lost its factual basis, but because its unanswered questions gave it a form that resisted closure. It became a reminder that even in an age of records, identification, and expanding government presence in remote regions, it was still possible for a human life to exist and end without being fully understood. The North itself remained unchanged. Rivers continued to freeze and thaw. Snow continued to erase footprints. Wind continued to reshape the surface of the land overnight. In that environment, the idea of disappearance was never extraordinary. What made this case different was not that a man vanished, but that he had lived so intensely within the system of pursuit without ever fully revealing himself to it. Years later, when people spoke of the mad trapper of Rat River, they rarely spoke only of crime. They spoke of endurance, of isolation, of the limits of human understanding in the face of an environment that neither punishes nor forgives, but simply exists. The story became less about resolution and more about the space where certainty fails. In the end, there was justice in the legal sense. The pursuit ended. The violence stopped. The officers returned home. But the deeper mystery remained intact, preserved not by lack of effort, but by the complete absence of a past that could be verified. And so the story closed not with answers, but with distance. A distance measured not only in miles of frozen wilderness, but in the gap between what was known and what would never be known about the man who called himself Albert Johnson. Long after the events at Rat River faded from immediate memory, the North continued to keep its own record of what had happened there. Unlike official reports or newspaper accounts, the land preserved no narrative structure, no clear beginning or end. It simply held traces of movement, violence, and disappearance beneath layers of snow that came and went with each passing year. For those who later traveled through the same region, there was nothing visible left of the cabin, nothing that clearly marked the place where a man had once lived in isolation and where a manhunt had once reached its violent conclusion. The Arctic had already begun its slow process of erasure. Yet the story did not fade in the same way the physical evidence did. It expanded. In the years that followed, the figure known as the Mad Trapper of Rat River became something larger than the sum of documented events. He was no longer simply a fugitive who had resisted arrest or a trapper involved in a dispute over territory. He became a question that resisted closure, a figure suspended between history and myth. The lack of a confirmed identity allowed imagination to fill the space left behind, and over time, that space grew wider rather than narrower. People who studied the case professionally often returned to the same unresolved tension. On one hand, there was a clearly documented sequence of events: a man living in isolation, complaints from neighboring trappers, initial police contact, escalation into violence, a prolonged pursuit across extreme terrain, and a final